And as Al Merrick said to me as a kind of consolation when I told him I was stepping off the tour, he said, well, the higher you go, the harder you fall. And what he was saying is, you didn't go that high, so it's not going to be that bad for you. So it's a backhanded compliment or a front-handed insult.
Is he part Australian?
No, totally. No, it was like a taking of the piss.
Welcome to the Water People Podcast, where we talk story with some of the most adept and interesting water people on the planet. I'm your host, Lauren Hill, joined by my partner, Dave Rastovich. For us, this is a place to exchange not just ideas and practices, but stories, experiential knowledge gleaned from the aquatic adventures that shape us. We acknowledge the Bundjalung Nation, the traditional custodians of the land and waters where we work and play, who have cared for this sea country for tens of thousands of years. Respect and gratitude to all First Nations people, including elders past, present, and emerging. Let's raise a glass to something bigger than just great beer. Meet Stone & Wood, a brewery that thinks big and acts small. Today, we're in conversation with writer Jamie Brisick. Before he was a Fulbright scholar, Jamie surfed on the ASP World Tour from 1986 to 1991, and he's since documented surf culture extensively. His writings and photographs have appeared in The New Yorker, The New York Times, and The Guardian. Jamie hosts the podcast Soundings and is the author of several books, including We Approach Our Martinis with Such High Expectations and Becoming Westerly, the transformation of surfing champion Peter Druin into Westerly Windina, which he adapted for the screen. Jamie popped by after the world premiere of his film The Life and Death of Westerly Windina at the Byron Bay International Film Festival, where it took home top honors as Best Surf Film, as well as the festival's highest recognition as Best Film. The Life and Death of Westerly Windina explores Westerly's upbringing, her years as a surfing titan, and follows her into a new chapter as she searches for acceptance from friends, family, a still hypermasculine sport, and most importantly, from herself. We were grateful to sit down with Jamie to chat about the film, the fire that took almost all his earthly possessions, where tech is taking surfing, and the sensation he's seeking in his surfing today.
We just sat down with Jamie Brisick, and Jamie is such a great voice in the surfing organism and has been for quite a long time. He was a professional surfer in the 80s and perhaps into the 90s too, but he was of an era of hard partying, pretty macho men type of culture. I just caught the last bits of that culture as a little grommet, and it was pretty intimidating and pretty intense and pretty toxic really. But though he was in there and among all that, he was always kind of just a kinder, gentler, more artistic voice among all of those blokes. And, nowadays we can listen to Jamie having conversations on behalf of the Surfers Journal with the Soundings recordings, and they're usually just so wonderful to hear all kinds of stories, and a couple have really opened my eyes to look at surfing in new ways, which is really wonderful. And lots of writing. Have you come across Jamie's written work or any of his artistic endeavors in your time?
Many times through various publications. He's someone that I look up to as someone who creates so much, who works in different mediums and tells stories in different ways. And we were lucky enough to have a look at his new film, The Life and Death of Westerly Windina. We watched it yesterday, and I was curious to ask you, Davey, what are your takeaways from that film?
Oh, so many. I think just an honouring of someone's uniqueness is really at the centre of it, and just real kindness in that experience of differentness. Just, us all being our unique selves, and perhaps in a culture the last few decades that has been quite rigid and one-dimensional, someone as colourful as Peter Druin and Westerly really can create a lot of tension in such a rigid little subculture. And what I found that Jamie and his filmmaking partner Alan got to achieve was just a real humanizing but super unique exploration into someone who's had so many direction changes, so many creative endeavors, and such an amazing surfing life.
And such a courageous one.
Yeah.
That was the real takeaway for me. The specifics of the story are about gender transition, but the more macro message for me was, here is someone who is deeply creative creative, and they're bringing their selves out into the world in varying ways, in such creative, flamboyant, larger than life, often culture defying ways. And how courageous is that?
Yeah. And I like too that, like for a subgroup, that surfing humans have considered ourselves anti-establishment and, lateral thinking and creative and wild and all that. And then, to have an experience where you watch this film and understand that perhaps, yes, we have been, but only to a certain extent. And there's some uncomfortable areas of rigidity in the culture that are being flexed right now, and for the better. But mostly, for me, the film is just about kindness, being kind to each other, allowing each other to be ourselves. And it just felt like such a great opportunity to have Jamie in our area. He's a native Californian and lives in a part of the world that we don't often frequent. So it was really nice to be able to sit down in the same room with him and dive into his story. He's had so many highs and lows and so much travel in his life, both internally and externally. He's really had some challenges to step up to and to navigate, and you can just feel that with him. It's a real privilege to be able to sit down and listen to someone who's been through some serious life experiences.
We always start the podcast by asking about a time or experience after which you were never the same. Would you be willing to share a story like that with us today?
Sure. I would love to have it be a triumphant moment, but it's far from that. It was learning that my wife had passed away via text message at about 5, 6 in the morning. I was in New York. She died. She was on her bicycle, and she was hit by a bus and killed. And we weren't together at the time, which made it even worse. But yeah, that was definitely the one that took me somewhere.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. That is really, really hard life experience to go through. Do you feel, when you speak of that now, how do you feel differently between then and now?
I think, so that was 11 years ago, and I think it forced me to learn a lot. I mean, it humbled me in such a huge way. And yeah, I think I'm just more empathic, kinder, maybe less ambitious.
Why that?
When I met my wife, I wanted to move to New York City. So we were together 11 years. We spent pretty much all that time in New York, although we traveled a lot. But I moved to New York very ambitiously, as people do. And my hopes, aside from this wonderful relationship that was unfolding that turned into a marriage and 11 years together, were more to sort of watch my writing career blossom. Did in some ways, but it definitely didn't in the kind of wooden way that I had in mind. And I'd started writing a memoir of my surfing life. And part of that was another sad thing, which is my brother died of a drug overdose kind of the second year I was a pro surfer. So my entire sort of 5-year on the world tour was this toggling between this kind of deep sadness and grief inside of me that I was trying to just basically sweep under the rug and then kind of be like Rocky Balboa or Muhammad Ali and be like a great athlete. And I kind of hid in that second part. And so I was trying to write that story, which is kind of ironic when you think about all this, and it wasn't working. And I had an agent in New York who was really rooting for me and, dangling the carrot of like, you're going to write a great memoir. And I had this idea of like being on the map as a writer, and it didn't happen. So when my wife passed away, I thought about the last 5 years of us being together. I was trying but failing to write this book. And most of the time that was kind of weighing on me. So I was kind of this brooding husband. And not to say we didn't have great times, but when she died, it gave me this perspective of like, the last years of her life, I could have been there in a way that I wasn't, because I had this self-absorption that was maybe not the most generous spirit to be bringing to a marriage.
So what did you do with the grief that time, that second time around?
I think the thing I learned was that the biggest thing, and I still have to remind myself of this because I am ambitious and I do place a lot of value in the work that I do, is I think the kind of like thing that I started thinking in my head is I'm never going to wait for the New York publishing gatekeepers to validate my joy in life. Like it's got to come from deeper than that. And whatever happens with my work, whatever audience it finds, whatever sort of income it provides and livelihood it provides, I just need to have fun. Because and that's maybe a more elaborate way of saying the more obvious, which is just like you only have today and live in the moment and enjoy the moment. And seize the day, et cetera, et cetera. But I try to remember that all the time. And I think I do a much better job of it now, actually. But the other side is to get back to the earlier thing. I mean, in the grieving process, I learned meditation. I had a deeper yoga practice. I had a therapist who I work with a ton. I did a very cliched sort of ayahuasca journey that maybe opened some stuff up. And there were like various microdosing psychedelic experiments. I did something called the Hoffman process, which is like an 8-day, very intense dive into yourself. So I did all these, I did this like inner searching through various modalities and also just conversations with myself, I think. Long walks.
Was surfing a part of that time in your life?
Hugely. This is sort of thematic to everything we're talking about here is I came up in surfing and I loved surfing and I was a pro surfer, and then I started writing for surf magazines and I was very much involved in the surf media, I suppose. And there were parts of it where I felt like I wasn't growing in the way that I wanted to, being challenged in the way that I wanted to, having the expansive conversations that I'd hoped for. And so when I moved to New York, it was almost in an immature-ish, kind of narrow-minded way of like, I'm going to just escape it. I'm just going to go find this big world, and I'm going to kind of cross-pollinate with other cultures and have that enlarge me as a person. And I sort of gave up surfing and I did do yoga, and I was physical when I lived in New York, but surfing wasn't at the center of my life. After my wife passed away and I moved back to LA immediately because the kind of hard edges of New York City I didn't want in anymore, it was like I realized there was something kind of sporting about going there for all that. And when that happened and I felt that incredible fragility that I did, it was sort of like, go back to LA, be close to family, find the ocean again. And I started surfing. My very good friend Alan White, who I worked on the Westerly film with, very generously sort of put me up in his place and essentially said, let's go surfing every day. And in the most generous way, and in a way that I didn't know, he was kind of like bringing me back to surfing. And I remember at the time, and this is great to speak to you both about, I had a Anderson longboard with a center fin and 2 side bites that Chad Marshall gave me. And I just decided to knock the center fin out, or not knock it out, but I'd take out the center fin and ride with the 2 side bites. And I'd seen a little bit of what Derek Hine was doing on the finless. I'd seen what you'd done, Dave, with the Alaya. And there was this idea of like, I'm going to play with side slip, which I'd always been anchored with 3 fins. I'd always had the traction of 3 fins. And I was surfing little point waves and getting this drift. And the drift, I remember like, it was almost like this like giddiness, this levity in my stomach that was so clenched tight. And I remember kind of coming out of the water going, that's the happiest thing. I like for a few seconds there, I was happy and I forgot everything that was weighing on me. And I can kind of take that feeling to other things. So I found surfing again in my mid 40s, the way I'd found it as like a early teenager, with all the anxiety and hormonal stuff of that period. And that same kind of like centered thing that we get from surfing, I found it again. And so now I'm kind of, I inadvertently, and in a way I would wish upon no one, I found surfing again and I'm into it.
Wow. Did you put the center fin back in eventually?
I did, and I wrote it sometimes like that, but I preferred it with I preferred the drift. The drift it's funny because I thought about it and I probably wrote about it at one point, but it was like the drift was almost paralleling where I was at because I felt like I was very much drifting.
A little out of control.
Yeah.
Yeah. Wow. That's amazing, Jamie. Thanks for sharing such personal, radical experience. You also lived through a few years later fire.
Yeah.
And when you and I and Derek saw each other the other morning, he, threw out the way he does that you two were bonded by fire.
Yeah.
in a way that's quite literal.
Yeah.
What was that experience? Can you walk us through that?
Yeah. So it was the Woolsey fire, which was a big fire in the Santa Monica Mountains. It hit Malibu and I won't call them towns or cities. They were the communities around it because they were all in the hillside communities. But yeah, it was a big fire. I didn't own my place. I rented a guest house with a roommate. It was a wonderful place with a great view over the ocean. But most of my life has been traveling. Most of that time, my lovely parents allowed me to kind of keep everything in the garage or in some stashed somewhere wherever they were living. And I had this great walk-in closet, and I decided, like, after all these years, to just take everything that was at my parents' and put it in the walk-in closet. And slowly, I thought, over the years ahead, I will go through all the memorabilia and photographs and all these things that I had. So I lost everything, all the earthly possessions, aside from my car. I think there was a surfboard in the back, because there's almost always a surfboard in the back, and a bag with my computer and what I was working on at the time. But I kind of lost everything.
Wow.
And the fire was really traumatic on the community. People had lost much more than I did because I guess I was never really possessive to begin with. But two things, I think. One thing is, it was 5 years after my wife had passed away. I moved to LA and to Malibu to kind of convalesce, or whatever you call it, grieve, find my way back to a life that felt better. So sort of 5 years after, just as life was feeling better and more solid and my stomach was feeling better and all the inner stuff was feeling better, this happened. And I just remember thinking, like, looking skyward and going, you got a wonderful sense of humor, whoever you are. This is terrific. I'm with you on this. And then the second thing was, I can't make this a big deal. I really can't. I don't have the time. Like I made my wife's thing a big deal in the sense of, when my brother died, I was a pro surfer. I was 21. He was 23. I was kind of on the run, and the pro surfing tour was about as good a place to hide from that kind of feeling as possible. And I think through relationships later, I think I realized that I paid the price. Like, you can't run from that stuff. And it came out in other places, in other ways. And so when Gisela passed away, I did the opposite. It was sort of like, I'm going to earnestly explore grief and do everything I can, to the extent that we know ourselves, to feel and to not run from this. So when the Woolsey fire came, I thought, I have to, I'm almost going to revert to what I did earlier, which is like, I'm just going to pretend this never happened in some ways. I'm going to deny it. I can't make it a big deal. And people would say to me, oh my God, you lost your place. What a tragedy. And I'd written about it so that people in my circles knew. And I didn't really say it, but I thought in my mind that, it's nothing really. It's like, I've experienced much worse. And so it did become, I think my running joke was, I sort of renounced materialism by default. I was just forced to the story I told myself was like, that stuff doesn't mean anything, and I'm just going to, soldier onward.
And has that been true?
I think so. It's funny because Derek and I were talking about it with you, Dave, and Derek said something that was to the effect of sometimes will I think about the things I lost in the fire. And I sort of did the same. I didn't want to itemize everything that I'd lost because it would just make it more painful. And so it was easier. And conveniently, the Woolsey fire happened early November. And so, but I was sort of in shock and processing it. And then I wrote a piece about it, which was in many ways a way to hide from it to some extent, or maybe a way to not feel it. There was something about focusing on the writing that distracted me from the pain of it all. And then suddenly we had Thanksgiving and the parties and holiday gatherings around that. And then slowly it was Christmas. It sort of happened at a time that allowed me to kind of be very social and not sit alone in the ashes, literally and figuratively, of the whole thing, and be feeling sorry for myself, which I just feel like I did way too much of after my wife passed away. So it was sort of, I was like, wow. Oh, and the one last thing, and that I think about with regards to the Woolsey fire, I was talking to Steph Gilmore about this the other day, and she talked about her 8th world title and how there was this Native American chant song that she got into her head and kind of used it to drive her through the 5 heats that she had to surf to win the world title at Trestles. And I was telling her right before the Woolsey fire, I was listening to something and kind of stopped listening, and the algorithm of my Spotify brought me the Grateful Dead, and I realized how much I like the Grateful Dead, and I did a kind of Grateful Dead deep dive, and I was listening to a bunch of Grateful Dead songs. And so when the Woolsey fire happened, I had Touch of Grey in my head, which is a buoyant song. And so while everything was sort of burning down, I was just kind of bopping my chin to this song. I don't know what it means or why I did it. It was like a security blanket I was clinging to,
Wow.
with the song. Yeah.
Classic.
Yeah.
That is some rich life experiences, Jamie.
Yeah.
And part of the thing that we really love about being able to sit down and do this with people is that sense of sharing things that are useful to others, just by, and not in that giving advice kind of way, but just by sharing your own story and sharing the way you manage to navigate turbulent water like that, and so I do feel really grateful that we can sit and speak like this, and certainly all of us will be touched by death in our life in one way or another eventually, and in Australia, likewise in California, a lot of us are touched by fire as well. So the fires are an experience that Australians lived through most years.
Yeah.
Is the thread of it.
Yeah.
Hugely a handful of years ago. So just the way you responded to those experiences, I feel really grateful that you've shared that way, and I know people listening will glean something from that, which is nice, because this essentially, it's a Water People podcast. It's about surfing and ocean related stuff, but rarely do we actually dork out on surfing. It's all these other stories which are really wonderful.
No, and I appreciate that's of interest to you, because I think and surfing is like this, and I find we're into design. There's a lot of, really happy, wonderful parts of it, and we are so fortunate. I think the other side, the stuff that I've just talked about, is to me more interesting. I think about this stuff a lot.
Yeah. I think it brings into relief really strongly how fortunate we are to have the ocean as an outlet,
Yeah.
to have surfing, to have play as adults.
Yes.
A lot of the adults that I grew up around have forgotten how to play.
Yep.
So I come back to surfing all the time, especially in those moments. My mom a few years ago had her leg amputated. She was in hospital for months at a time, and it was really the ocean that I could go to with grief and to cry into and to throw myself into, that caught me in a way that no one else could have.
Yeah. I know. Well, it's interesting, because I would guess that there are surf films that if we started talking about them, we would all enjoy, and they're probably more lyrical, maybe slowed down, etc. I'm making assumptions here, but I'm guessing. But then there's a lot of kind of really revved up, surf content out there. And what I often think about that's not depicted is the contemplative kind of interior stuff that happens when you're sitting there waiting for a wave and staring at the horizon and watching swells loom and what have you.
So, that's most of the surfing experience.
Yes, for sure.
Actually standing up on a wave is minuscule compared to everything else.
Yeah.
One of the really exciting feelings I had in that moment before you rocked up this morning was actually a familiar feeling for me, where throughout the decades of doing surf adventures and surf projects, I've always had this real leaning towards the writers and the photographers on trips more so than the fellow surfers or the people in front of the camera, just because of the specialist nature of a lot of pro surfers can make life quite one-dimensional.
Yes.
Whereas the writers, the filmers have all these different life experiences, and you've had both. And one of the things I was really interested to sit and chat with you about was that position you're in right now. You have the Surfers Journal podcast, where you sit and speak with all kinds of people, and you write, and you've written for so long with all kinds of people in the surfing organism. What's your perspective on surfers and surfing in this moment right now? Where do you think we have come from, and where do you think we are now, and perhaps where we're going? How does it feel as an organism to you now?
I love the word organism. I think anything I say will be so my narrow little perspective, parts of it that I pay attention to.
But not that narrow, because you do speak with and are aware of a lot of the different branches of the tree.
No, well, yeah, I think that's true. The one thing that I like right now is it seems like the surf industry the money is not thumping the way it once was. I think that's actually really great. I think it's created a lot more experimentation and kind of, mom and pop enterprises that I think are really good for it being the organism. I came up in the 80s and I kind of watched the whole thing boom. And I was sponsored by Quicksilver when I was 15, I think, 1982. And then
What was your sorry to interrupt, but what was your hometown? Where were you going?
Where
were you then?
I grew up in Westlake Village, which is the valley side of Malibu.
Yeah.
So I grew up surfing the beaches around Malibu. Yeah. And it wasn't technically the San Fernando Valley, but as most people understand it as the valley, and I'm happy to call it the valley because it's the uncool place to live. So I had about a 25-minute drive over the canyons to go surfing. I was always kind of fighting that back, and it maybe made me surf harder. And I know a lot of people. I went to the same high school that Cassia Mayador and Trace and Chad Marshall went to. So I watched Quicksilver grow, and then I watched them go to an IPO and become a publicly traded company, and to have, quarterly reports that needed to show growth and progress. And I think in many ways, and I'm so grateful to Quicksilver for providing me opportunities to travel, but I did watch in many ways probably where the company was founded by surfers who wanted to just sort of perpetuate the lifestyle and earn a little bit of money along the way. It got so big that I think that maybe got lost to some extent. So right now, I think I love the experimental side of it. I do watch the World Tour. I do watch high performance surfing, and I enjoy seeing it. I don't really relate to it. I think bigger than it's ever been. I have two sides to it. The one part is as someone who sort of documents the culture and is less interested in the high-performing athlete than I am probably people older than that window, and interesting people. I love that I have in common with people who I admire tremendously the surfing part. And I've written about artists, writers, et cetera, who we share surfing in common, but then the conversation might be something else. The hard part, of course, is that it's gotten so crowded that when I go surfing, I have less enjoyment than I did, and I have to quiet this voice in my head, but I have the classic, it was better 20 years ago, and I remember when I could go out here and get all the waves and all that stuff, but I know that that's like the nonsensical conversation, and I just try to smile and have fun with the crowds. So I guess my engagement with surfing in the water is very humble and very kind of just I get in, get a couple, and I'm good. I body surf and I enjoy that. But yeah, I don't know where it's going. I mean, it does seem like it's going in good directions, I think. I think people are finding it for the right reasons, and I think that there are people like yourselves sharing the surfing lifestyle in a way that is honest and real and has depth versus the kind of like cool, fashionable side that some people embrace it for.
Do you feel a sense of responsibility to surfing culture as someone who's grown from it and out of it? Do you feel a sense of having to give back to it?
Recently I've been doing stuff with the Surfrider Foundation, and doing that has made me, being brutally honest, realize how selfish I've been, because it's sort of this thing of I should have been doing this a long, long time ago. The environmental side I'm aware of and I want to do more with, but
I would say you contribute a lot culturally.
Well, thanks. But in many ways, whatever compass leading me towards things has been less, I've been less aware of it in a like responsible, this is my legacy and my name attached. I've come at it way more humble than that. And truly, it's been like survival. It's been working a lot because I do need to earn money. But of course, like also following the stories and the people and the places that interest me most.
You've spoken publicly about how writing doesn't make you a lot of money, and so by necessity you need to be prolific. Is that a career structure you'd recommend to young creatives?
That's my story and a lot of my peers. But then there's other levels of writers who, get $500,000 advances for their novel in progress.
Not many.
Yes, for
Not
sure.
Very many.
No, writing is just, and knowing some, maybe even many of those people, they too have their struggles, and it may not be financial, but there is the pressure of performing, providing making the next book as good as the one they did before.
Yeah.
So it's an anxiety-ridden thing. But I do think like so much art making is full of insecurity, and there's almost like you're almost inevitably just going to get beaten down, and it doesn't matter who you are and how much you may have the external successes, but it's going to happen internally, or you're going to suffer in your romantic life, or it's like always a high toll.
You've spoken about how you often don't, because you're working at such a pace, you don't take the time to stop and reflect on whether something is good or not. And you've just premiered The Life and Death of Westerly Windina here in Byron. I think it's the world premiere.
Yes.
You got to see an audience see your work of 12 years, more than a decade. How was that experience for you?
Well, it was rewarding and great and fun, and it felt nice to sort of let it go because we worked on it for 12 years. And I worked on it with Alan White. We co-directed together. We spent so much time in it. And I think he and I both experienced this. If in the first couple of years, and as the story was unfolding, and we were so blown away by Westerly, and it was this character who I felt like, when I say character, that's the wrong word, but character in the context of a documentary, but this person and friend was so just vivid and engaged and creative and constantly putting out work in the form of writing things, writing little sketches, sending videos, et cetera, et cetera. Being around that was really exciting. And there may have been a point early on, I'll speak for myself here, where I thought, oh, this documentary is going to be great and it's going to be good for my career. And I might have had that thought. But going so long and having it be, the odyssey that Westerly/Peter went on, I felt like Alan and I went on as well. We went on our own personal one. My wife died in the making of that. So I really let go of the like ambitious artist part of that equation. And then that became a thing of, is this thing ever going to see the light of day? So it feels really, really good. It's sort of a relief. But I also, and I know that it's almost a cliche, but I also feel like it's just this thing out there. And if it touches people, if it inspires conversations with people, between people, I'm happy for that. But I don't have that like auteur kind of thing of like, look at this thing I did at all. So far from that. I may have a different story with maybe an easier story. That might have been a possibility to be like, look at what I did. I feel like I've gotten beaten around probably for good, probably in ways that I needed to now have this thing of great humility with it all. And I hope it has a life. I hope it does well, and love to see some source of income from it that could provide the next thing. But there's no like smugness. There's no self-congratulations at all.
One of the standout themes for both of us watching the film was the tenderness that you bring to the story and the tenderness you bring in your friendship with Peter, well, just Westerly, really. Mm-hmm. Who modeled that for you? I was wondering, you know, surf culture, the surf culture that I grew up with anyway, and probably you to even higher degree, was very macho, very unemotional, not so compassionate. Mm-hmm. So who in your life modeled that kind of tenderness and compassion for you?
I mean, I would say for sure my mother and father. And my parents, they had a hard run in the sense of they lost their firstborn son when he was 23. They were separated at the time. The problems with my brother, his addiction problems, lasted for 5 years before he eventually passed away. And the tension in that and other things separated my parents. But then they got back together later in life. And then they were together. My dad died a few years ago, but they were together to the very end. So I had that modeling from them. My dad was a really gentle guy. He definitely was far from macho. Really loved my mom.
Was he a surfer?
No.
Was surfing in your sphere at home at all?
No, my dad grew up in New Jersey, went to Notre Dame, was a publisher's representative, which meant that he sold textbooks to universities, professors, so that he was very much in academia. And he wrote a lot. He wrote over 20 novels that were never ever published. So he really valued, he was really like higher learning and spending time with books. And this sort of interior life was really important to him, and he always encouraged that.
Wow, no, we have to honor that incredible creative discipline, 20 novels.
Yeah,
unpublished.
Probably closer to like 24 or 5. I lost count. I could go home and count because we still have them all printed out.
What a model for staying true to your craft.
Yeah.
Like, despite any worldly acknowledgement.
I feel that way too.
Yeah.
I think of it as he's in many ways, he's like the highest level of being an artist in some ways. However, being his son, I don't want to do that myself in the sense of there is something that happens when you put work out and then it does inspire a conversation. And in many ways, it mirrors back to you things that maybe help shape where you go from there. But no, my parents were really great. And honestly, Westerly was so fragile when I met her, and I wrote a profile for the Surfer's Journal. I probably did way more conversations between Westerly and myself that ever needed to happen. What was like fact check, what started as like, hey, I'm calling to fact check this thing in the 1966 such and such, and then that would be an hour-long, what were Skype conversations back then. And then Westerly might ring me 3 days later and say, hey, you know, I was thinking about that thing and blah, blah, blah. And then, oh, by the way, my son's doing this, or I had this. So we really did become friends. And in some ways, I love surfing so much, but I definitely felt that I hated the homophobia. Trans wasn't so much out there at that time, but there was transphobia around Westerly for sure. Mm. And there was probably, you know, transphobia in the culture that I grew up in, even though it didn't have a voice or it didn't have a target the way it might today.
Well, that's maybe one of the upsides of the longevity of this project is the conversation around transgender people has really come to the forefront in our culture.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I think it's been so great.
I feel like there are many audiences waiting to see this film
and
who are going to be so richly stimulated with conversation and questions because of all the time you've put into this project.
Yeah. I hope it has a life for the sake of that thing that you just mentioned.
One of the standout lines to me, and again, I was watching knowing we were going to sit down and have this conversation, so I was trying to pick up little threads of your personality in the film. Most people won't watch it that way, but you talk about some of the inherent dangers in surf stardom, the inflated ego, the early expiration dates.
Yeah.
Can you talk about that and how that transition was for you coming out of being on the tour and then landing where and how?
It was so brutal, actually. I'm always fascinated when I see, because I do pay attention to surfing, when I see sort of surf stars or surfers who've had big careers, when they decide to kind of go on to the next next thing. I'm always curious to see how that transition will go. For me, it was really, really hard.
I would say for most, right?
Yeah, yes.
Yeah, and I would say professional athletes across the board.
Yes, definitely. And as Al Merrick said to me as a kind of consolation when I told him I was stepping off the tour, he said, well, you know, the higher you go, the harder you fall. And what he was saying is, you didn't go that high, so it's not going to be that bad for you. So it's a backhanded compliment or a front-handed insult.
Is he part Australian?
No, totally. No, it was like a taking of the piss.
But even the lifestyle alone, just being on the tour, is virtually unfathomable to most people who get out of high school and go to college and get a job in a corporate setting. Like, it's still the dream life, even if you're placing last in every contest.
Absolutely. And all my friends and kind of family were the best surfers in the world at the time. I was ranked in the 40s, so I never was in the top. But I did every contest, and you both probably know this, is like you go into it. It's almost like the interior monologue is like, I'm so good, I'm so good, I'm so good. And you're trying to build the kind of confidence and the audacity to think that, in my case, I could beat Tom Curran, or I could beat, you know, Damian Hardman, Barton Lynch, Gary Elkoten, Sonny Garcia, etc. And I think when you do that and when you reinforce that in your head, when you do step off or fall off, you forget how singular that thing is, and you forget that most people are more humbled. And as someone who grew up in the U.S., you know, all my peers had gone to college and they had the college experience, and maybe there was a socialization that would happen in that, and there were people who maybe excelled, but they were in a classroom. It wasn't this sort of, you know, pro tour mentality of just pumping yourself up. And then when you do achieve a little bit, as you both know, I think you get in the magazines, you have that thing. I remember watching, like, Brad Gerlach was one of my peers, and, you know, Brad could like buy a motorcycle and roll up to the French event on the bike, and that would be written about in the magazine by Sarge or whoever. And so you were kind of aware, you became self-aware in a vanity kind of way. You became like, I remember like having a leopard skin cap, and that showed up in the magazine. It was like, okay, I could wear these glasses, and playing with your own image, which is super fun. If it lasts forever, I think it's great. If you can ride it to the very end of your life, or if you die early or whatever, fabulous. But knowing that there's like that time when you have to kind of fall back to civilian life, as Rabbit likes to call it, it's hard. So I went from basically signing autographs on the beach in Brazil to about 2 weeks later, I was working at a surf shop in Newport Beach, Sydney. Oh. And it was just brutal. And I was drinking too much.
What were the feelings inside of you?
That if this is what life after pro surfing looks like, I'm not sure I want to hang out for it, pretty much. That was like in my despair, that's what I felt. And I'd been in a relationship that was ending, but I probably like sped up the ending and maybe sabotaged to some extent. I was drinking a lot. I smoked a lot of weed at the time. The time I was on tour, it was almost like a badge of honor to really party hard.
Oh my Lord.
So bad.
I was a little grommet at the end of that era, really, like when, you know, the momentum generation came and really made a change because they started winning a lot, and they didn't do that. And what I got to see when I went to France the first time as like a teenager, I think I was like 17, no parents, no guardians, no rules. It was just an amazing experience, though it was terrifying to see all your heroes, which was all your contemporaries, at Rock Food. You know the Rock Food, Roland's Rock Food story. And they would be raging so hard all the way till sunrise. And the badge of honor, like you were saying, like, was to then go to your heat and like pretty much like throw up in the shore break or between your top three waves. Win the heat. Continue on with the day, do it again the next night, all the way to the finals. And it was so extreme. It was like everyone was partiers with the occasional surfing problem. You know, it was such a different realm than it is now. I don't know. It was, you know what it was like because you were in the center of it.
Getting on it was the expression among everyone, like, you getting on it tonight, and that meant like partying hard. Thankfully, I'd had like a bad experience with cocaine when I was really young, so the coke was never my thing, but the drinking I definitely did. I think what's sad that I think about now as my life kind of expanded is just how it was just sort of mindless. You know, when I got really curious about writing, well, I read, and then I started writing, and then I met journalists, and then I met writers, and then I saw this, you know, this like curiosity that was really strong, and I realized that's the thing. And when I think back, it was really kind of cynical, the idea of like, as soon as we get knocked out of the contest, we're just going to get as fucked up as we can. I mean, it's just like, what a terrible thing to say against the world, you know? And I was around a lot of that. And while we were we were in our 20s, most of us, and everyone was sort of fit because of surfing. But in terms of sort of where your brain was headed, I look back and it was just so negative in so many ways.
I can see why surfing careers didn't last beyond the 20s at that point.
Yeah.
Like, how could you possibly?
Well, the thing that happened, and I saw a lot of it, and I may have had it for a short time as well. And I think probably a good example, and I don't think he'd mind my saying it because he's been very open, as Tom Carroll would say this, is like you're surfing, and then if, 75% of it is the surfing and 25% is the partying, when you step off the tour, those things can swap. And then you're past your surfing days, but that addictive thing that you had becomes more prevalent. And then you really have to figure out your life, you know.
I've heard that you've since stopped drinking.
Yeah.
Is that true? And what led to that decision for you?
About a year and a half ago, I did. And it wasn't something I thought about that much, but every year I've usually done, a month or so without drinking. And it wasn't like I was drinking really heavy. It was more the spirit I was drinking. I was doing it maybe alone. I did a lot of writing, sipping wine, which is kind of great. And in some ways I miss, because it was this opening up and slowing down that I sometimes struggle to get to normally. But there were a few things that inspired me. One was Barry McGee, who's a friend of mine. He's an artist and surfer. And I remember sending him a picture of a couple of dudes standing around drinking beers. And he replied something like, is there anything sadder than a couple of white dudes standing around holding beers, drinking beers? And I thought, you know what? I know exactly what you're trying to say right now. And I agree with you. And I'm actually out of frame because I shot the picture. But there was a beer in my hand at the time, and I'm doing it too. And what a lazy, it's just maybe too easy of a thing. And also just like a conformist thing that I suddenly sort of questioned and realized I don't want that to be my life.
I grew up with that version of surf culture too, where I saw it a lot in the adults around me growing up. It was like the only way people knew how to have fun was to lubricate themselves with alcohol to be able to let go.
Yes.
There's a real hiding, a real numbing.
Yep.
Have you created other habits to replace your wine sipping while you're writing?
Absolutely. And my therapist, after my wife passed away, and my wine sipping was like a drinking through a bottle a night a lot in a really despairing way. I remember telling her I'm probably drinking too much. And she said, what time do you start drinking? And I said 6 o'clock. And she said, okay, well, 6 o'clock is when you go to the yoga class or the meditation class, but you have to replace it. And I think I've replaced it with a lot of yoga and meditation, not necessarily in that window. I mean, now it's been so long that I don't even think about it. But yeah, just sitting with my feelings, as cliched as that sounds, but just being comfortable with it and sitting in it and breathing. I think a lot of breathing exercises, not in a Wim Hof kind of way, but in my own way. And I guess, and it's fun talking to you both because I admire you both tremendously for this, and I think you both do it really well, which is, it's hard to even talk about this, and anything I say is going to sound kind of absurd, but listening to your inner music, if that makes sense, or kind of finding that part of yourself that is the most you and being in it and letting that be your self-expression in some way.
Please stay tuned while we take a quick break to acknowledge the folks who help make our podcast possible.
Let's raise a glass to something bigger than just great beer. Meet Stone & Wood, a brewery that thinks big and acts small, right from the heart of Byron Bay. Stone & Wood isn't just about brewing beer, it's about building a community. Certified B Corp and driven by environmental and social responsibility, they're all about making a positive impact one sip at a time. Their philanthropic arm, the Ingrained Foundation, supports local grassroots organizations, channeling funds and volunteer hours straight into the communities they call home, focusing on environmental and social causes close to the heart. Here's to Stone & Wood for crafting exceptional brews and for making a tangible difference in our Northern Rivers community. Patagonia is in business to save our home planet. Founded by Yvonne Chenard in 1973, Patagonia is a surf and outdoor apparel company based in Ventura, California. As a certified B Corp and a founding member of 1% for the Planet, the company is recognized internationally for its product quality and environmental activism, as well as its contributions of nearly $230 million to environmental organizations. Patagonia's unique ownership structure reflects that Earth is its only shareholder. Profits not reinvested back into the business are paid as dividends to protect the planet. Futures makes the first surf fins from recycled fishing nets. Alpha Net Plus is an innovative collaboration between Futures Fins and Borreo, blending carbon and discarded fishing nets. To date, they've transformed more than 35,000 kilos, that's about 77,000 pounds, of discarded fishing nets into new alpha fins at their headquarters in Huntington Beach, California. Nets that would have otherwise ended up in the ocean. Made for high performance and tested by the best, from our very own Dave Rastovich to friend of the podcast, John Florence, Alpha is available in a wide range of fins for those who want to make a difference with every wave you catch. Learn more at futuresfins.com. The best summer surf seasons go hand in hand with fried eyeballs. Looking perpetually red-eyed might be an indicator of good times, but it also hurts. Good sunnies are non-negotiable, but ours inevitably get jumbled in the beach bag and the lenses get shredded by sand. Child, that's C-H-I-L-D-E, Eco Eyewear reimagines the way we use sunglasses. Instead of tossing out frames because of scratched lenses, the Child for Life program offers free lens replacement up to 12 months from purchase and for a small fee thereafter. Child makes sunnies and prescription glasses from plants, not petrol. It's eyewear that's made to last and able to be repaired for a smaller energy footprint. Let's reimagine the culture of disposability together. Learn more at childeyewear.com. So much of the film that you've made in Westerly's story is about the basic human struggle with identity.
Yeah.
Are there times, maybe you can tell us about one of them, when you've struggled with your own identity, and what has it been that has brought you back to that, to yourself? To the truest part of yourself.
Yeah. I mean, I think I always do, quite honestly. I mean, I think I'm someone, I question everything, and most of all myself. So I wish I lived in the id more, so to speak. But I feel like I'm kind of always on the outside of things. And so I'm not always in the moment. I think the hardest times I've had, I mean, just being really hard on myself, just the classic stuff that I think we all do, some more than others, but being really hard on myself. And I think through my surfing career, the one thing I will say is I worked really hard to be a pro surfer. And as an amateur, there were times when I think I had natural skill, but then as I tried to focus it towards the pro ranks, I realized I maybe wasn't the most gifted. I didn't come from a place that had the waves that would kind of cultivate the skills that would bring you around the world. I came from a place where it was mostly knee high.
I can relate.
Yeah. And while I was on the tour, when I look back at some of the videos of myself, I'm just really like wound up. I'm like squeezing tightly. And I remember when I stepped off the pro tour, I was living in Sydney. I worked at Waves magazine. I was kind of documenting surfing to some extent. And I also had a part-time gig with Rip Curl and The Search. And Derek Hind and I were always really, really good friends. And it was when Tom Crone was on The Search riding alternative equipment and surfing so beautifully. And Tom Carroll was a good friend, and I went surfing all around kind of like New South Wales with Tom. And that year after I was off on the tour, I did the best surfing of my life. And I always feel like there's a big lesson in not trying too hard. And I think to some extent my kind of purest form, the place I identify most at this stage of my life is as a writer. And I can see when I'm trying too hard, and I can see it constricting. And it's exactly like the thing that I did with surfing. And it's sort of that thing of how to let go.
Can you tell us about the nitty-gritty of your process writing? Are you very structured? Do you sit down for a certain amount of time or a certain number of words? What does it look like for you?
I wish I were more structured. I write everything longhand. I mean, I do a lot of journalism, and I'm typically working on something more long form that will take years to write. But I write in the mornings. I meditate first thing in the morning. I have coffee, and then I sit down to write. Sometimes it's 90 minutes. Sometimes it's 2.5 hours. I don't really sit at a desk. I sit on like a sofa, kind of lean back, bad posture stuff, actually.
Is your back okay?
Yeah, it's okay. But I definitely don't, I'm not, all those things that are corrective, I don't do. And in a weird way, and this might even be a surfing thing, is like I'm hunched into it, and I'm hunched in with my notepad, and it really has become like my body mechanics naturally, my cell memory is like naturally wrapping in this thing, which I pay for sometimes. But I work a lot, and I didn't for a long time. And it's so easy to circle around writing, I think, and you think about it, and then you get almost scared of the confronting, An
empty page is one of the most intimidating things, isn't it?
For sure. But I've gotten over that, and I've gotten over it partly because I recognized that I was doing that, and I looked at the people. I'm always thankful to the artist Raymond Pettibone, who I looked up to my entire life, wrote about a few times, and then have since become friends with. And he is a visual artist. He draws, paints. He adds a lot of text to his work. And he's someone where what I took from him, and I might be romanticizing, and if he were sitting here, I might say, no, it's not like that at all. But what I saw in him was he sort of turned drawing and making work into his nervous tick. It was sort of like a thing that you're always doing it. So rather than the kind of procrastination circling around that I did for a long time, which was like, oh, I've got to write this thing, and I'm like not putting the hours in. Now I'm almost the opposite, where I spend a lot of time in it, and I am less afraid of that.
Wow, that's so great. I feel like there's going to be someone who's listening to that who can apply that and learn so much. That's amazing.
I hope so, but it took a long time to do that too, because I think, and coming from, you both can relate to this, but coming from surfing, I think, speaking for myself, it always felt like sort of my birthright, and also my like priority every day was to be close to the water and to surfing. And so for a long time, it was sort of like surfing first, writing second. And then as my writing dreams weren't kind of amounting to what I'd hoped, I realized, oh, I'm not working hard enough. And moving to New York really humbled me in that way. I think when I was living in Venice Beach and living a kind of like exaggerated bohemian existence and smoking lots of weed and being very social and fancying myself a writer and probably calling myself and talking about myself as a writer, but I wasn't writing to the extent that a lot of the people who I met on the East Coast when I moved to the Northeast were doing. So I kind of built rigor into my practice, but much later.
Did you do The Artist's Way?
Yeah, such a good book.
So that morning ritual.
I do it all the time, actually. Yes. Yeah. The morning pages in that, I think in many ways, maybe there was a time when my evening writing with a sipping wine was that very thing, but it's kind of tapping like stream of consciousness and getting out of your own way and just letting things come out. Those morning pages in The Artist's Way, Julia Cameron, that book is so good.
It really stands the test of time.
Yes.
Yeah.
It's great.
You mentioned smoking weed. We were just in Venice Beach. We were just in the States visiting my family. We were there for about 4 weeks all up. And I hadn't been back in a few years. And what I really noticed this time about American culture were two things. One was the number of cannabis dispensaries, and two, and I can't help but draw parallels between them or maybe some relationship, two are the number of Amazon Prime trucks that are absolutely everywhere. That doesn't exist here in the same way.
Yeah.
Do you see a relationship between the two? And some reflection on American culture. I just feel like, is everyone just getting stoned and buying things online?
No, that's so interesting. Or the sort of the immediate gratification of it all too, like wanting something and it's going to be here right away.
Yeah.
No, it's been really interesting being here the last week, because it's not something I didn't know already. When I moved to I spent time in Australia, and I fell in love with a girl and moved to Australia when I was 23, which was 1990. I was on the tour for much of that time, so I was traveling a lot, but I was kind of based here for about 3 years. And then I've come back a lot working on the Westerly film every few years. But being here this last week, things are slowed down here. Lives are centered around the ocean in a way that they're not in Southern California. Or when I say that, that's generalizing, but I'll say LA, where I'm from.
Yeah, I would say Florida too, where I'm from.
Yeah. The cost of living is quite high in LA, which creates anxiety, and people have to hustle a lot to sort of keep it up. I mean, it's ironic because in many ways you want to center your life around surfing in the ocean, let's say, but then the coastal real estate has gone so high that you have to really hustle to make it happen. You know, there's a lot of metered parking on the beach, which I always think is just a terrible idea, because the whole idea is to like let people go down to the beach and unwind and be less anxious and edgy. But when you have to go running, as I've done, going out for a surf and then have to run in and check my meter, it's defying the kind of idea of like having this recreation and freedom. The weed's really prevalent, and I think the weed is what may have been like Prozac some years ago is now like people are self-medicating in that way.
Not to demonize weed, but it just seems like maybe the scales have tipped a little far.
Yeah. For sure. And I'm not, and won't demonize the weed as well. And I smoked plenty of it, but I do think sometimes it can be, I don't know. I learned there was a time when I was on Lexapro. I was in a really low place, and that's an SSRI and it's an antidepressant. I never ever wanted to be on one, and I always thought I was above it to some extent. And I got on it for a while, and it helped me get through a rough period, but I also realized it was almost an easy way to do the thing that might take an hour of like doing hot yoga or, you know, going on a long bike ride or even like cold plunge stuff. There are other ways that are maybe not as simple as sipping a pill with a glass of water.
How did you come off that medication?
Well, I wasn't on for that long, but then my doctor explained that you have to, I wasn't on a high dosage at all, but the whatever milligram dosage I was on, you have it and then you quarter it and then you're off.
Did you come to a realization, though, that you didn't need it anymore, or you were ready, or?
You know what? My giving in, if I'll call it that, to SSRI coincided with How to Change Your Mind by Michael Pollan about microdosing and psychedelics. And I thought, I want to be doing that. That sounds way funner than the little white pill. But I realized that there's something called serotonin syndrome where if I did both together, I might just my system might kind of go bad. So weirdly, my motivation to get off the SSRI was I'm going to go do psychedelics. And I had friends who were doing it. But when I got off the SSRI, a friend of mine introduced me to hot yoga, and I'd done yoga all my life, but I got really into that. And I realized that was kind of like taking the baseline of whatever neurotransmitters, probably serotonin among them, to this place where I was like, I don't need to be taking the pill anymore. I'm good. But it requires me to drive 35 minutes, park, go to this class, sweat, move, and then
pay for it.
And pay for it.
Yeah.
So it was a harder route, but ultimately way more rewarding.
Wow.
You mentioned Michael Pollan's book. We love to talk about books on this podcast. Are there other books that you frequently recommend to people in your life?
I read more fiction and probably literary fiction. And it's funny because a lot of the stuff I read I would recommend to fellow writers, but I don't know and I say this not in some elitist way, but for someone who doesn't read a lot, it may be, it's like musicians, you're reading these subtleties of at the sentence level that most people aren't reading. They're reading more for content or a good story. But no, I read mostly fiction.
All right, I want to change direction really abruptly. And I ask this question with full respect.
Sure.
For both you and the Surfer's Journal. You work closely with the Surfer's Journal. And there's often a lot of literary allusion in the Surfer's Journal. Why are there no women in it? You've done a great job with Soundings at having more women involved, but it feels like a creative direction choice at this point. I go into local Patagonia shop and pick it up, and I do the Bechdel test, which is, you flick through, are there any women writers, photographers, photos of women surfing, and there often aren't.
Yeah.
What's the deal?
Yeah.
And I know that's not necessarily your creative decision.
Yeah. Well, I think I do know that there are a lot more coming.
Yeah.
I think there's been an effort to put more women in the magazine. I do think that if you go through the back issues, a lot of the Surface Journal is historical. If we go out right now at the pass, it's Sunday, there will be, the percentage of women to men will be one thing, but it was not that way 20, 30 years ago.
Yeah.
And I think because the Surface Journal they mine the past for a lot of historical stuff, there's less of that. But I know that they're making great efforts to correct that. And I mean, it's not even correcting, it's just what's in the present day. I mean, I think with the podcast, that percentage is becoming more equal.
Yeah. And I ask that question with full respect for the Surfer's Journal, too, because I have deep respect. It is the most beautiful publication in surfing, and it's only out of that deep respect that I just want to see more women included.
Yes, for sure. No, and I think, and I understand that, and I think that is happening, and I think in forthcoming issues, you'll see much more of it.
Yeah, that's exciting to me.
Yeah.
Can I ask a question, Lauren?
No. I'm just going to barrage Jamie for the
Jamie,
next hour.
I can't remember where we were, what we're doing, but I remember we went on a bit of a listening binge to Soundings and the people you had spoken to. It was perhaps a year or so ago, but I was really loving the range that you had in guests, and in particular I really loved the one with the fella, of course I've forgotten his name, is it Chaz maybe, but he is the guy who wrote about addiction, The Drop.
Oh yeah, Thad Zolkowski.
That's what it was.
Yeah.
And I loved the bit about the rats and about surfers and that parallel, or that same kind of nature to ourselves. Yeah, can you remind us of that? Because I would love listeners to go and listen to you chatting with him.
Yes, well the book is called The Drop. It's by Thad Zolkowski. It's about surfing and addiction. And to some extent, it's about how the excitement of surfing can kind of feed you right over to addiction. The high of surfing is sort of one that's maybe hard to come down from in the sense of throughout your entire life. And so Thad is sober in recovery. So he draws on his own personal experiences, but then he interviews and chats with many people who have experienced addiction, some of whom are great surfers that we all know. The rat story, I'm struggling to remember it exactly, but I'm imagining it's it's one with just wanting more and more cocaine and will basically just die to keep the cocaine going?
Also, it was about and I'm probably butchering it too, but it was about the variable nature of the feed. So when the people were experimenting on the rats, which I totally oppose, I can't stand the animal cruelty realm for us just verifying things that we should know in our bones anyway. But he was describing how rats in a space that had food that was given to them rigidly at the same moment in the same way, those rats would get really lethargic and expectant of that feed, knowing that it's coming. They'd just go over and have the feed and go back, and they were flat,
Right.
And the rats that were fed in a sporadic nature had a very different quality to them.
Yes.
And he was drawing that parallel with surfers, and that when we are ocean people and we go to the beach every day and it's varied, it creates this level of animation in us, this level of interest where, just like us, when we wake up and go, I wonder what the surf's like, and it gives you energy to want to go to the beach and see what the ocean's like.
Yes.
That can keep you moving and healthy and vibrant. Anyway, that was what my memory latched onto with that.
No, and now I'm remembering, and that is it. And it's so interesting that, and I think talking earlier about sort of following our own inner music, another version of that is, and I think as surfers we have this where there are no guarantees. You don't know what's going to be like. And I think that shaping your life around that, and being ready to go when it's on it's a unique thing and such a special thing. I think a lot of people, we maybe take it for granted because this is the lives we live, but being ready for that time.
Yeah. I think that's probably one of the layered reasons why I deeply am embarrassed by the wave pool fascination that's coming out of the surfing organism right now, is that essentially by creating a wave pool, you are force feeding the rats.
Yes.
You are providing a consistent and reliable mechanized opportunity to get the feed, which is waves.
Yeah.
And so therefore we are lessened by that experience. If you were to be a surfer that just goes, there's no surf at the moment, or the ocean's dirty, I'm going to go to the wave pool.
Yeah.
And you go do that, then to me, it seems like we're being railroaded into that kind of rat that expects things that way.
Yes.
And in no way is that bringing a betterment to the state of the world or ourselves, from my point of view.
Yeah, no, I love this. I
have a lot to say about those silly things.
Do you want to talk about Lamar?
Yeah, I'd be interested to know your perspective, Jamie. So we just recently went through the States, like Lauren said, and we went to Yosemite for the first time with our dear friends Chris Delmoro and Maggie and their boys. And we didn't know this, but to get to Yosemite, you drive through those mass industrialized agricultural lands where Lemoore is, which is where the wave pool thing that Kelly did is.
Yep.
And we were driving along and we're looking at people on these lands that I wouldn't call farms, but they're lands with rows and rows of crops growing.
Yep.
And the farmer was sitting on the tractor in a hazmat suit with a gas mask on, spraying the crops. Berries, perhaps, I think it was. Anyway, we saw that, and that was quite the shock.
Jeez.
Like, oh, wow, that's how you grow food here. That's interesting. And then miles and miles and miles
Not just there, I'll say.
All
In a lot
over,
of
industrial
places.
ag, but the scale of it, I've never encountered the scale of that area, that flat plain, just miles and miles and miles and miles of it, and then miles of plastic wrapping the soil as well, just radically industrialized. And then you get to the mountains and you see this place that has this legacy built by the John Muirs and the Galen Clarks. This incredible legacy of appreciating and then protecting these Mama Earth, just protecting a slice of this beautiful planet. And what struck us was that you'd have these two things side by side, and that surfers, who perhaps we would hope have a deep relationship with the living planet, looked at that space and interpreted their version of a surfing future in line with those industrial agriculturalists, not right next to it, the John Muirs and the incredible American legacy of protecting and celebrating this beautiful planet.
Yeah.
And so anyway, it was really shocking to us, and just that proximity of those two things exists side by side, extremes.
Yeah.
And that surfing the organism has been dragged into that mass industrialized idea of mechanized waves.
Yeah.
So anyway, we were spouting about this for hours and we were driving through just baffled by it. Do you have any thoughts around that?
No, well, first of all, if you haven't already, I hope you write or talk or make films about this, because it's really great observation. I've been there twice and I've ridden it twice, and I did recognize it in the agricultural place, but I didn't get the John Muir side of that equation. So I only saw it sort of in this place that the smell in the air was like not what although I did surf in Ventura a lot, and there's an agricultural area at Santa Clara Rivermouth on the offshores, you smell, fertilizer, etc. No, I don't know I honestly don't know. I don't have a real hard line about them, but I don't disagree with anything you just described. I think they're strange. They're really...
What does it say about us?
Yeah.
Yeah.
As someone who's diving into that surf rider realm where you live and having this interest in, hopefully our reciprocal role.
Yes.
When we're our best selves with each other, we're reciprocal. It's not a one-way street. You've got friends who are one-way streets. They're not really the greatest of friends or whatever. When we're reciprocal, life is bettered. Yeah.
I so agree.
I have to say that it's not that we haven't surfed them, because we both have.
Yeah, not that one in particular,
Yeah.
but
Not
we've been to those.
Yeah. Well, I think, the obvious one is that the Kelly Slater Surf Ranch being the first one, there was a lot of experimentation. They had to sort of, it was an experiment that actually succeeded. And I think they were probably looking for a cheap place to have this big, and apparently I think it was already like a kind of lake thing for some jet skiing or whatever it was. So the fact that it lands there, I think, was maybe less by design than the fact that it was just a cheap place to rent and it was secret and all the rest of it. But I absolutely get the kind of strange juxtaposition, and what it does say is fascinating. Yeah, I just kind of observe, and I know it sounds like I wish I had like a harder line with it all, but I really don't. I just sort of observe it, and I find it interesting, peculiar.
Where does it take us as someone who has grown with surf culture over several decades now? Where's the logical delivery point for us as a culture if we pursue the proliferation of wave pools?
All the romance and beauty of surfing that I enjoy, it doesn't reside in the pool, that's for sure. I can say for myself personally that the being in the ocean is the thing. Being with the uncertainty and the kind of ephemeral nature of it, may be there tomorrow, may not. Like that to me is, my entire biorhythms are sort of have developed in accordance with that. So the idea of it's always there 24/7, you can put lights on it, the waves come at this interval. I don't know if any of them are with chlorine, but we often use chlorine as an example because we think of that as like swimming in a chlorinated pool. But no, everything that I love about surfing is ocean-based.
I don't think we have to necessarily demonize wave pools, but I think it's worth us sitting down and having real dialogue about it.
Yeah,
like why?
For sure.
Are they bettering our lives, our culture,
Yeah.
the living spaces that we inhabit?
Yeah.
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 Given that, Windina Shiva is one of the greatest women on the planet, and she's an incredible activist out of India and food grower and just incredible woman. She's written a book called Water Wars.
Okay.
And she illustrates how, battles basically over water are at the core of so many, if not all, conflicts around the world.
Yep.
And they might be wrapped up with religious tones or political tones, but underneath is the reality that people are fighting over the ability to survive
And that will
grow
probably
food.
be increasingly true as climate changes.
And we look at California, just look at the water scenario there and pillaging from other states and other parts of America.
Yeah.
That to me is of more interest
Yeah.
than any of the silly things about surfing, whatever.
Yeah.
Surfing's just there. But that is really something I feel would be great for us to dive into and, like Lauren said, just discuss in a way where I feel like we've got more of a community that is speaking and listening to itself now more than ever, and it's really wonderful, and it's so enriching compared to like when you and I were younger, and I was younger than you, but I inhabited that space in the 90s and felt the monoculture nature of the surfing organism of that time. don't you feel that at that time it really was quite a monocultural space to be in?
Very much
and
so.
Perhaps right now it's branching out in different ways.
Yeah.
And that's in some way enriching and feels better.
Yeah. Yeah, it's an interesting one because I think what we were talking about earlier, where for myself as an observer and as someone who does write profiles of people and meet people and interview people, surfing has expanded, and I'm kind of amazed. I've written about people I admire tremendously, not for their surfing, but maybe for their art making, let's say, musicians, etc. And surfing is that common thread among all of it. Interestingly, in the present day, a lot of the people that they may not be exactly my thing, or I don't have a direct example of this, but some of those people are riding the pool for the first time before they even go in the ocean, which is fascinating.
Yeah. I'm aware of time, and we've got a wandering 7-year-old around who's rolling his eyes. And you've got lots of other adventures in the Shire. Sorry, Minnow, I thought I saw your eye roll when you walked in. Surfing is high art. We've heard you say that, and I feel like it'd be nice to dive into that in some way with you. Also because you've spoken of having relationships with artists, people who create art.
Yeah.
What is art to you? What is an artful form of expression, or how do you define the term art?
For me, it's just a pure form of expression, and whether it's expressed through a musical instrument, or whether it's expressed on a canvas, or whether it's expressed on the page or through dance. I think it's often just the making of the thing that I'm most interested in or inspired by, I guess. And to me, there are people I've started with the work that they make and how it moves me, but there's also sort of the person behind it and how they're living their lives. And at this point, I'm kind of most inspired by people living artful lives, I suppose. Like, it's less about, that person, paints or draws in a way that connects with me. And that is wonderful, and that's moved me, and I think that's probably been the initial naive thing that has taken me towards, I'm interested in art when I was younger and naively. But now most of all, and it's apropos to the conversation we're having here, because I'm just trying to figure out how to live well, honestly. And I look to other people for examples and for lessons or tips, and thinking of the surfing as high art. I'm curious about your body surfing. But I love body surfing. I've seen videos of you, Dave. You're very good at it with no fins.
Yeah, but that's just about physicality. When I'm shaped like paper, right? So that helps. You look at Mark Cunningham; he's also shaped like flat, like a piece of paper.
He's got the anatomical
it's just
advantage.
low. Yeah, there's not really any deep insight into other.
It's
other
not
than
just that,
having
but
low drag.
Right, but extending this question, which you asked to me, but I think to try to get to the essence of the question, if we can collectively answer, when you're in the water and you're moving with waves, shaping yourself to waves, choosing which wave to take, having all your senses attuned to what the ocean's doing and how it's moving, what is that like for you?
I see what you did there, and spinning that round, buying yourself some time perhaps, and then maybe even Lauren, you'll go next, and then you get even more time. That was masterful. I was swimming yesterday, actually. I was body surfing a small point break around home, and I had this just deeply satisfying experience of moving my limbs and my body in response to the wave and having it felt directly. So there's nothing in between my body and the wave when that's happening, like a surfboard, which can interpret and change the experience a lot. And I just started thinking about how wonderful it is when we don't hand over things that we can do to tools, others, or technology. And that experience, like you were saying about writing, you love to sit down with just a pen and paper or a pencil, whatever you use, but you don't sit with the computer when you begin writing like that. And I like that experience of full interaction between me and the other thing, whatever it is. And so it's like, if you drove from here to the beach through a forest and you drove from here to there, you get to the beach, but you didn't get to hear the geckos, the birds, the rustling of reptiles on the ground, whatever. There's a diminishment there by bringing in this convenient tool, the car. Yeah. Compared to the walk. And so it's that sort of feeling for me with body surfing. It's just this direct communication with the water. Perhaps that's a word you could use. And it just feels really intimate, actually. It's probably a more appropriate word.
Yes.
Really, really intimate.
Yep.
Jamie, you've been through many iterations in your surfing career. I'm curious about what sensation you're chasing now. When you get in the water, what's the feeling that you're hoping to experience?
I think kind of levity most of all. Feeling light in my body, feeling not deeply attached to things is I aspire to, I suppose. And so I think surfing is this sort of reminder of that. And really, and in many ways, and I feel like I'm doing a good job of it now, and it may just be by virtue of years and decades. But again, going back to what we talked about earlier, like being a pro surfer, my identity was there, my ego was there. It was bringing out parts of myself that oddly enough, like are almost the opposite of how I see the world now and what I value now. And so I think for a long time post-pro surfing, it was, well, there was a period, I think I had a run where I was still surfing well and I was really active and I was fierce in the water. And then I sort of became 40 and then realized, well, I'm not performing. And then it became a humbling experience. And then my ego would be there and I'd watch someone better than me, watch a guy like Dave, paddle circles around me. And no, I'm kidding. That never happened. But what I mean is like,
Thank you.
No, of course it didn't. But what I mean is like watching another generation kind of take the throne that I was off to the sides of at one point. So getting over all that. And so now I recognize my best surfing happened already. I don't have the time or the energy or even really the desire to that's not where my focus is, performatively. So it's really just being in the water and getting the kind of recharge and the kind of buoyant mood that is what I want to bring to my life in general. That's like the thing I'm going for. And so it's like more play. I think it's more play. And it often happens body surfing. I mean, I put on fins a lot and it's flopping around and I kind of like to just surrender to the ocean and almost don't fight or kick or paddle or make any efforts and just sway with the ocean and let it kind of wash around.
What does success look like for you now?
I don't want to say being happy, but being joyous, contented, feeling good where I'm at and having it be less external and just having it come from the inside.
Thanks for listening with us today. If you like what you heard, please consider sharing an episode with a friend. Our editor this season is the multi-talented, absolute legend, Ben Jake Alexander. The soundtrack was composed by Shannon Soul Carroll, with additional tunes by Dave and Ben. We have a few new Water People experiments this season. You can find every episode of the podcast on our Water People YouTube page, or subscribe to our very infrequent newsletter to get book recommendations, questions we're pondering, and behind-the-scenes glimpses into recording the podcast and more via our website, waterpeoplepodcast.com. We'll be continuing today's conversation on Instagram, where we're at Water People Podcast.